Jared Diamond is professor of geography at the University of California, Los Angeles. His work includes 5 best-selling books, and he is here today to talk about the most recent book entitled Upheaval, Turning Points for Nations. Written from the perspective of someone who experienced firsthand the histories of 6 countries where he lived, breathed, and was conversant in 5 of 6 languages. I asked him which language he did not speak. He said Japanese, but he has Japanese relatives. Upheaval loosely completes a trilogy with his books, Collapse, How Societies Choose to Fail or Succeed, and the widely acclaimed Guns, Germs, and Steel, The Fates of Human Societies, a 1998 Pulitzer Prize for general nonfiction. His international reach has extended to translations of his works in 38 languages, and his notable research, teaching, and lifelong field work has earned him the MacArthur Foundation Fellowship Genius Award, the Japan's Cosmos Prize, as well as numerous research prize, teaching awards, lectureships, and grants from the American Physiological Society, National Geographic Society, the Zoological Society of San Diego, among others. Professor Diamond has been elected a member of all 3 of the leading national scientific academic honorary societies, the National Academy of Sciences, American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and the American Philosophical Society. His breadth of interests in conservation, ecology, biogeography, physiology, and ornithology has touched nearly every continent of the world, with over 22 expeditions to New Guinea and neighboring islands to study ecology and evolution of birds. His biological exploration is credited with the rediscovery of New Guinea's long-lost golden-fronted bowerbird at the top of the remote Foa Mountains, previously known only from specimens found in a Paris feather shop in 1895. Professor Diamond devised a comprehensive plan for Indonesia New Guinea's national park system. He is director of World Wildlife Fund US and Conservation International. Professor Diamond notably adds a psychological dimension to this most recent book, Upheaval, where he combines history, geography, economics, anthropology to examine how nations and individuals respond to crisis through selective change, a well-documented coping mechanism that is typically linked to personal trauma. Professor Diamond takes us on this journey of restoration experienced by nations recovering from crisis, usually brought about by calamities or threats to their national identity. He tracks Finland in World War II era conflict with the Soviet Union, Japan's search for modern stability following Hiroshima, Chile's struggle under dictator Pinochet, Indonesia's rise from colonialism, Germany's post-World War II rebuilding and rebranding, and Australia's rise from British penal colony. He examines the challenges within each country and their respective paths towards recovery through the widely used 12-step approach. As one reviewer writes about Professor Diamond's detailed analysis of history and his internationally inspired therapeutic approach to make both nations and individuals more resilient is nothing short of epic, urgent, and groundbreaking. Please join me in welcoming this awe-inspiring scholar to our Politics and Prose community of lifelong learners. Jared?
Let me first check whether you can hear me okay in back. Can you hear? It's a great pleasure for me to be back in Washington under less adventurous circumstances than my first trip here. My first trip to Washington was also my first intercity travel by myself. I was born and grew up in Boston. And when I was about 14 years old, I was a Boston representative of the Junior Red Cross that had its meetings in Washington, D.C. And so I took a train journey from Boston to Washington. The first time that I traveled by myself My parents put me on the train. I arrived. In those days, it was a big deal making long-distance calls, but I suppose that when I arrived, I called them. I have no memory of it now. Only when I had my own children did I realize what my parents must have been going through when they wondered whether I was going to arrive in Washington, because parents worry about their children. Today, as we speak, my twin sons are 32 years old, but one of my sons, Joshua, today as we speak, is driving from Los Angeles to Zion National Park. Probably he has not yet arrived in Zion, and he's 32 years old and much more competent in traveling than I am, but parents are parents, and I'm wondering whether Joshua got okay to Zion, just as my father undoubtedly in those days wondered whether I got okay to Washington, D.C. I did get okay to Washington, D.C., and I've been coming back ever since. The types of books that I write are books of comparative history. Most historians write single case studies. They write about one country, typically in a narrow time slice. So you get a book about late 19th century Germany. And writing those single case studies allows you to devote all 499 pages of your book to Germany, which you can discuss in lots of details. I don't write that sort of book. It has its value. Instead, I write comparative histories, comparing different countries. If you compare different countries, then you can devote fewer pages to the country, but comparisons allow you to pose questions and answer questions that you would never raise and could never address in single case studies. For example, there are so many books on the American Civil War. With an entire book on the American Civil War, you can devote 6 pages to the second day of the Battle of Gettysburg. But those books on the American Civil War never notice or discuss one of the most striking facts of the American Civil War, which was that at the end of the war, the victors did not kill the losers. In fact, only one person on the losing side, the commandant of Andersonville prisoner of war camp, was killed, and that's really unusual. At the end of the Finnish Civil War, at the end of the Spanish Civil War, the victors did kill the losers. If you write just about the American Civil War, you don't notice that and you don't answer that. Why is it that the American Civil War was so unusual in that respect? That's an example of the things that you can notice and answer by comparative studies. My current book, Upheaval, which follows on my previous books of comparative history, The Third Chimpanzee, Guns, Germs, and Steel, Collapse, The World Until Yesterday. My current book, Upheaval, compares national political crises in the countries that I know best, where I've lived, where, except for Japan, I speak the language or spoke the language, and where I have friends going back 60 years. They are countries that suffered political crises, either as a result of an invasion or a threatened invasion. Finland, the tiny country of Finland, invaded by the Soviet Union on November 30, 1949. Japan threatened with invasion after centuries of isolation by the arrival of Commodore Perry's fleet of steamships with cannons in 1853, which forcibly ended Japan's isolation and launched Japan on a decades-long process of westernization to be able to resist the West while still maintaining much of Japanese identity. A couple of crises consisting of internal explosions. I lived in Chile 6 years before the Pinochet coup d'etat. I've been working in Indonesia in the aftermath of the Indonesian genocide of 1965, when the Indonesian army and people that are put up to it killed at least 500,000 Indonesians. And then there are a couple of slowly unfolding crises in countries that I know well. I was living in Germany on the day that the Berlin Wall was erected, and so over the decades I've seen how Germany has gradually dealt with the legacies of the Nazi era and gradually laid the grounds for its reunification. And Australia, when I began working in Australia in 1964, Australia still had a white Australia policy. And then over the decades, Australia gradually undid that policy to the point where today Australia is second only to Israel around the world in the fraction of its population that is immigrants or children of immigrants. And when I brought my son Joshua to Australia for his semester abroad in 2008, and I walked Joshua across the University of Queensland campus, I felt as if I was on the University of California, Berkeley, or UCLA campus, namely an Asian majority campus. In 1964, that was unthinkable in Australia. So Australia and Germany had crises that unfolded slowly with a change in national identity. All of those crises constitute gut-wrenching histories, interesting for themselves, but they also raise practical questions of why some countries deal with crises more successfully than do other countries. Perhaps those recent crises in modern countries could provide guidance for the crises now developing in the US and Britain and Japan and in the whole world. Naturally, there are many books by historians already about national political crises. I'm looking at national crises from a new perspective, namely the perspective of the personal crises that all of us have to deal with as individuals. And I'm sure you've all been through personal crises and you know their causes from your own experience or the experience of your friends. You know that people are thrown into crisis by the breakup or threatened breakup of marriages or other relationships, or the death of a loved one, the death of your child or spouse or parent or sibling that throws into doubt your view of the world as a just place, or a serious setback to your health or career or financial security. You've all experienced it in yourselves or you've seen it in your friends. All of those types of crises pose a question that we either confront or that we avoid confronting. What did I do wrong? What do I have to change about myself? What's gone wrong in my life? What of myself is okay and doesn't need changing, and what does need changing so I don't get into this mess again? Naturally, I'm interested in personal crises because of my own experience of my share of them, but also because my wife, Marie, is a clinical psychologist with a specialty in crisis therapy, which is a branch of psychotherapy counseling that instead of seeing a client for years and having the leisure time to explore what happened to you in early childhood and how that affects you now. Crisis therapy instead involves seeing people in a crisis who have to find a new way of dealing with life fast. Typically within about 6 weeks, or a crisis therapist sees a client once a week for just 6 weeks. It's got to go fast because you all know from your experience that when you're in a crisis, you can't stay in a state of limbo forever. You either have to find a new way of dealing with the world or you relapse into your old non-adaptive ways. And in the saddest cases, clients in there are cases of suicide. So crisis therapists have to figure out fast who is dealing with their problem and who is not dealing with their problem. Marie would come home at the end of the week when she and her fellow therapists would meet and go over the clients that week to figure out who was making progress and who was not making progress. Marie and her fellow therapists recognized a dozen factors, which again, all of you will know from personal experience, a dozen factors that affect the outcomes of personal crises. And as Marie talked about these factors, I recognized that similar factors, or at least ones for which those personal outcome factors serve as metaphors, similar considerations apply to the outcomes of national crises, although of course, national crises also pose unique problems of their own. Nations have leaders. Individuals don't raise questions of leadership. Nations have to reconcile conflicting interests of groups. We as individuals, an individual doesn't have to reconcile conflicting interests of groups. The outcome predictors that Marie found for personal crises, and again, they're things which all of you have either experienced or seen in other people, that map against outcome predictors for national crises. You know that the first step in dealing with a crisis is acknowledging that you're in a crisis. If you deny that you're in a crisis, of course you're going to get nowhere towards resolving Another early step is accepting responsibility. It's tempting in a crisis to blame it on other people. Oh, poor me, victimization, self-pity. It's all the fault of those other people. But if you blame it all on the other people and don't accept responsibility that there's something that you can do yourself, of course you're not going to make any steps towards resolving the crisis. And already you can see the analogies to national crises. Nations may acknowledge or may deny crises. Nations may accept responsibility for their problems or may deny responsibility and say that the problems of the United States are the fault of Canada and Mexico and China and nothing's wrong with the United States, which is a guaranteed way not to solve American problems. You know from your experience that in a personal crisis, it makes a big difference whether or not you get help from other people, emotional or material help from friends, and whether you can look to other people as models of how they solved similar problems. Well, nations, too, either get help or they fail to get help from allies, not from personal friends. And nations, too, may look to other nations as models, or they may refuse to look to other nations as models. You know from your personal experience that honest self-appraisal is essential. You have to be clear about what's working in you and what is not working in you. And nations, again, to solve crises, have to practice honest self-appraisal. Those are just some examples of the outcome predictors for personal crises that you've all experienced or that you've seen friends and relatives experiencing, but which in some cases have close parallels for national crises, such as getting help from countries rather than friends. And in other cases, the outcome predictor for a personal crisis certainly doesn't apply to a nation. For people, there's an important quality called ego strength. Psychologists recognize the ego strength of a person that enables you to get through a crisis. Nations, of course, don't have ego strength, but that suggests a metaphor. Nations, while they don't have ego strength, do have national identities, which are suggested by ego strength, and national identities are important in a country getting through a crisis. Well, that's abstract, so let's consider an actual crisis. And this crisis that I experienced the lead up to is also the one I developed my books by teaching the material at UCLA to my UCLA undergraduates year after year until the book is ready for publication. The material of this book I first taught to my UCLA undergraduates in 2013, and I've taught it each year since then. And the story that I'm about to tell you now is the one that my UCLA undergraduates and I find most upsetting as a national political crisis because the parallels to the United States are so obvious. I lived in Chile, the Latin American country of Chile, in 1967. At that time, Chile is the Latin American country with the longest history of uninterrupted democracy. And when I went to Chile in 1967 and my Chilean friends explained their country to the visiting American, the thing they said was, "We Chileans, we're not like those other Latin American countries. We are a democracy. We have an uninterrupted history of democracy for the last 150 years. We know how to govern ourselves." That was the sentence. We know how to govern ourselves. This was 1967 in Chile, but Chile was also, at that time, spiraling into a breakdown of political compromise. Does that suggest to you anything about the United States today? Breakdown of political compromise. In 1967, none of my Chilean friends foresaw how it would play out. In 1970, Chile democratically elected a President Salvador Allende, who had been a great minister of public health, but who adopted disastrous economic and foreign policies. He tried to change Chile too fast, even though he had only won by a plurality and 2/3 of Chileans voted against him. And so it was not a surprise to Chileans that there was a coup d'etat that overthrew Allende in 1973 by the Chilean armed forces under General Augusto Pinochet. What shocked Chileans was that the military government remained in power not for a couple of months, but for 17 years and smashed world records for sadism and torture. Pinochet did get the Chilean economy on track by taking as a model the free market policies of Milton Friedman, or what he perceived of those policies, at the University of Chicago. Pinochet eventually miscalculated and was voted out of office in 1989, and democratic government returned to Chile. But the Chilean socialists, when they came back into power in Chile democratically, those socialists, 100,000 of them, those who had not been killed, many of them had been living in Western Europe, where they saw socialism operating differently, in contrast to the breakdown of political compromise and the intransigence of Chilean socialists in the 1960s. Chilean socialists living abroad had watched socialists operate in Western European countries, and they saw that socialists could achieve a lot of their goals by not being intransigent, but by compromising with those of different views, while the Chilean socialists also saw socialists and communists in Eastern European countries plunge those countries into disaster. So the socialists had learned, and Chile today is once again the most democratic country in Latin America. This story of Chile illustrates parallels between personal crises and national crises. Chile underwent selective change. Under Pinochet, Chile changed some things. It adopted a military government. It changed its economic policies, but Chile remained a Catholic, relatively homogeneous country without any change in its borders. When the socialists came back into power, there was again a selective change. The socialists reintroduced democracy. They reintroduced liberal social policies, but they retained, in fact, they increased the military government's free market policies. This illustrates then the importance of flexibility, which you will know from your own experience is important in dealing with personal crises. National flexibility is important in dealing with national crises. Chile illustrates the importance of a model, the model of a free market economy, for pointing to Chile a way out of its economic difficulties. Chile illustrates help and lack of help that you all know from personal crises. In this case, help from allies or lack of help from allies. Allende was undermined by the withdrawal of American economic help, and Pinochet was bolstered by the return of American economic help. And then Chile also illustrates the importance of a strong national identity in getting through a national crisis. When the first socialist president came back into office after Pinochet, Aylwin, in his inaugural address, Chileans who had suffered under Pinochet were hoping to hear how he was going to take revenge on the people who had, the government that had killed and tortured so many Chileans. But Aylwin, in his first presidential address, said that his goal was to build a Chile for all Chileans. A Chile for all Chileans. And what that meant was that in the election that had turned Pinochet out of power, even though it was a democratic election, 45% of Chileans had still voted for the military government. And Aylwin recognized that the socialists were going to have to compromise with the military government. A Chile for all Chileans meant a Chile in which the tortured and the relatives of those killed and tortured would have to live together with the torturers. And what made that possible is Chile's strong national identity, a national identity in which there has not been a taking of revenge as there was after the Finnish and Spanish civil wars. That's one of my case studies, one of the things that I experienced, one of the national political crises that I experienced. And by now, you may have been or you should have been getting uncomfortable, because what happened in Chile was a breakdown in political compromise, resulting in an end of democracy. Chile illustrates why we study history. It happens in other places. It's happening today. What we're experiencing in the United States today is a breakdown of political compromise that has been setting in. It's usually dated to the 1990s. The breakdown of political compromise, you know all the signs. recent Congresses have passed fewer laws than any Congress in modern American history because Congress can't agree, can't reach compromises on passing laws. You've seen the non-compromise of federal and state executives with their legislatures, such as is going on now in the United States. You've seen the breakdown of compromise between federal government and state governments. My state of California is involved in so many lawsuits against the federal government. The federal government is involved in so many lawsuits against the state of California. You've seen the breakdown of compromise between legislatures and the judiciary, the gradual loss of independence of the judiciary. Recently, the legislature of the state of West Virginia impeached all of the Supreme Court justices of the state of West Virginia. So the breakdown of the decline of political compromise, I see as the most serious problem now threatening the United States, because democracy is a great form of government, but democracy involves compromise. And if there's not compromise, then it's not a democracy. The other current problems of the United States, you know well. Democracy involves voting, and if a substantial fraction of citizens are prevented from voting, they're prevented from registering, as is the case in the United States, then that country is a democracy only in name. A democracy involves citizens who have succeeded in registering to vote actually voting. The United States has the lowest voter turnout of any major first world democracy. The highest voter turnout for any major recent election in the United States was the 2008 presidential election, when the voter turnout was 61%, only 61%. The most recent election for mayor of my city of Los Angeles. LA is one of the biggest, most important American cities. Mayor of LA is one of the most important urban political jobs in the United States. And in the last election for mayor of Los Angeles, 20% of registered voters of LA could be bothered to turn out to vote for mayor, and 80% didn't even bother to turn out. Well, if you are dissatisfied with your government, it's your fault for not having voted. Other problems of the United States that you know well are the decline of socioeconomic equality, the fact that fewer and fewer 1%, half of 1%, 1/10 of 1% of the people control something like 80% of the money in the United States. And you've also seen the decline of government investment in the United States for public purposes. So all of those things threaten American democracy. American democracy is not threatened by Mexico and China. There's no way Mexico and China can end democracy in the United States. The only people who can end democracy in the United States are we Americans. And if it ends, it's not going to end. Yes, democracy ended in Chile. It ended in Chile by a military coup. Democracy is not going to end in the United States by a military coup. The American military has never been involved in politics. If or when democracy ends in the United States, it's going to be by a continuation of the things that are going on now. The restriction of voters' abilities to register to vote, and the apathy of so many voters not voting, and the breakdown of compromise, and the inability of legislatures and executives to get anything done. Well, let's apply the outcome predictors, Marie's outcome predictors for personal crises, and their extensions or their differences as outcome predictors for national crises. There are features of the United States that give me cause for optimism, that make me think that things will end okay in the United States. And those include our geography, which protects us on east and west by oceans, and on north and south by land borders with non-threatening neighbors, Mexico and Canada. Whereas other countries like Finland and Germany have powerful neighbors, which restrict their freedom of choice. The United States has great freedom of choice for geographic reasons. The United States enjoys the largest expanse of the richest farmland in the world. The United States has a strong national identity. We Americans identify as being Americans. sea to shining sea, land democracy, rags to riches. We Americans have evinced political flexibility during the last 70 years. The party in power is usually lost at the presidential level the next election, so the United States flexibly has moved back and forth between political parties. All of those characteristics, flexibility, strong identity, freedom of choice, make one cautiously optimistic for what's going to happen to the United States. But there are also reasons to be pessimistic about what's going to happen in the United States. And I rate the chances as significant that the United States within the next 5 or 10 years will no longer be functioning as a democracy. The causes for pessimism, again, are ones with which you're familiar. Many, perhaps most Americans don't acknowledge that we're in a crisis now. Of those Americans who recognize that we're in a crisis, many, especially those in command of the federal government, don't accept responsibility, but blame our problems not on ourselves, but on Mexico and China and Canada. But if you deny responsibility, you're not going to address what you are doing to make a mess yourself. The United States today is characterized by a lack of honest self-appraisal, but without honest self-appraisal, you can't deal with reality. And perhaps most serious to me is what's called American belief in American exceptionalism. This term, American exceptionalism, means the belief that the United States is exceptional, it's unique. Yes, the United States is exceptional and it's unique, but that doesn't mean that we can't learn anything from other countries, because the problems that the United States faces, we face problems of how to register voters, and health, and immigration, and education, and prisons, and balancing individual community interests. But Canada and Australia and Western European countries also face similar problems of voting, health, immigration, education, prisons, balance between individual community interests. In many of these areas, such as health, and education, Americans are profoundly disillusioned, dissatisfied with how we are dealing with these problems. And yet there's much more satisfaction in Canada and Western Europe with how their governments deal with these problems. So it would behoove us to look to our close neighbor Canada or Western European democracies for guidance in how to solve these problems that all democracies face. But because of our belief in American exceptionalism, we suffer from the fantasy that there's nothing that we can learn from other countries. And that is a reason for some pessimism about whether the U.S. will learn from other models and resolve its problems. Well, since at this point you may be feeling somewhat depressed and overwhelmed by all the problems that I've been discussing, let's end on a cheerful note, namely the state of the world today, the problems that the world faces. Tra-la. What are the major problems that the world faces? One can debate it. I would identify 4 major problems that the world faces, namely 4 things that could wipe us off the planet or could undermine civilization within the next few decades. And my choices of the world's 4 most serious problems are, of course, the nuclear risk, that there will be a large-scale nuclear war, precipitating the whole world into nuclear winter, for example, an exchange between India and Pakistan, or between the US and North Korea, or terrorists acquiring nuclear bombs as they tried to do in 2001 at the time of the World Trade Center's attack. Second major problem for the world is climate change, which at the rate it's going now could cook us all within a few decades. There's the problem of sustainably managing world resources that are essential for us. Essential for civilization are natural resources such as energy, forests, fisheries, soil, fresh water. But all of these resources are being managed unsustainably at the moment, are being depleted faster than they're regenerating, or with the result that we can't keep going for more than a few decades. I'd estimate 30 years by 2050 before we start to run out of these essential resources. And finally, a major world problem is inequality among countries around the world. Inequality 1 billion people in the first world enjoy living standards on the average 32 times higher than living standards for 6.5 billion people in the developing world. And some decades ago, Americans could take the attitude, well, isn't it sad for all those people out there in Africa and Asia and Latin America that they suffer from a much lower standard of living compared to us, but that's tough luck and it's their fault anyway. But nowadays, in this globalized world, it's impossible for rich countries to coexist with poor countries because in this globalized world, poor countries have a way of consciously or unconsciously sharing their dissatisfaction with rich countries. Unconsciously, through the spread of diseases such as malaria and TB and AIDS from poor countries with inadequate public health systems. With globalization, travelers from the US to developing countries and vice versa carry these diseases with them. So chikungunya fever from Uganda is now spreading to Europe. Malaria and dengue are starting to spread to the United States. People in poor countries can share their dissatisfaction by attempting to immigrate. And when there are 6.5 billion people who realistically would be much better off if they could immigrate, that's a problem. And then there's the support for terrorists that develops in countries where most citizens are dissatisfied and have reason to be dissatisfied. The United States and Western European countries have their own crazy terrorists. It's not the case that Afghanistan has any monopoly on terrorists. The United States had its Timothy McVeigh, who killed 150 people in the Oklahoma City Veterans Building. But because the American citizens are more or less satisfied, there was not widespread support for Timothy McVeigh in the United States. And similarly, in Norway, there was a crazy Norwegian who shot 81 children and then detonated bombs, wounding about 350 other people. But there was not widespread support in Norway because Norwegians and Americans are more or less satisfied. But in countries where people are chronically dissatisfied, and when they understand realistically that they and their children are not going to have a better lifestyle, there is support for terrorists. So those are, as I see it, the big problems facing the world. Again, let's apply Marie's outcome predictors to the whole world. What's going to happen to the world? Initially, you might think there are grounds for pessimism because there is not worldwide acknowledgement of world problems. There is not worldwide acceptance of responsibility. We in the world are not going to get help from green extraterrestrials out in the Andromeda Nebula to solve our problems. We in the world are not going to be able to look for models of solving world problems from the red extraterrestrials on planets orbiting Proxima Centauri. We in the world do not have shared core values. And it might at first seem that there are few precedents for the world getting together to solve world problems. In fact, if you will eventually look at my next to last chapter in my book, Upheaval, about world problems, take a look at the next to last chapter about world problems and imagine that it stopped 6 pages before where it actually stops. That was the first draft of my chapter on the world, and that chapter on world problems ended pessimistically because it appeared to me at the time that the world does not have a track record for solving world problems, but then I learned better. The fact is that in the last 50 years, the world has succeeded in solving really difficult, thorny problems, either by bilateral agreements or by regional agreements or by international agreements. Here's a case of a bilateral agreement solving a problem between 2 countries locked in the worst hatred, Israel and Lebanon. What 2 countries could have more difficulty agreeing on anything when Israel has invaded Lebanon and when Lebanon is a base for firing rockets at Israel? But Israel and Lebanon lie on the eastern Mediterranean migratory pathway for migratory birds. Every fall, lots of birds, including big birds, pelicans, eagles, storks, fly from Europe along the Eastern Mediterranean, through Israel and Lebanon into Africa. And then in the spring, lots of birds, millions, billions of birds, including big birds, eagles, storks, herons, fly from Africa through Israel to Lebanon into Europe. And those big birds, they collide with airplanes. So it turns out that the leading cause of plane crashes in Israel and Lebanon is not military action, shooting down each other's planes. The leading cause of plane crashes in Israel and Lebanon is collisions with these big migratory birds. It was something that I experienced, that my family and I experienced personally, because when we were on a plane flight in a small chartered plane, there's a boom, something had hit the plane, and our plane carried on, but when we landed, we saw that our plane had a hole in the wing, and in the hole, there was the body of a dead eagle, which had collided with our plane. It didn't bring our plane down, but there are lots of those collisions that bring down planes, including military planes, in Israel and Lebanon. Well, despite all the hatred between Israel and Lebanon, Israeli bird watchers and Lebanese bird watchers reached an agreement that they weren't going to discuss politics at all, but they were going to tell each other about bird migration. And so, seriously, each year in the spring, Israeli bird watchers, when they see a flock of pelicans going overhead, heading north, they'll call up, they'll radio their Lebanese colleagues and say, we've got 75 pelicans coming your way, and they'll arrive late afternoon, and the Lebanese FAA closes down air traffic in Lebanon. And then again in the fall, when the birds are migrating south, the Lebanese bird watchers will contact their Israeli colleagues and say, we have 132 storks heading your way, get your planes out of the air, and the Israeli FAA closes down its sky. So here's an example of how countries with even the worst hatred have managed to solve difficult problems. That's a bilateral agreement. There are also regional agreements that the world has succeeded in reaching in recent decades. The disease Rinderpest, the worst livestock disease, the disease Rinderpest no longer exists because agreement was reached between all the countries of Europe and Asia and Africa to eliminate Rinderpest. And boy, was it difficult to get every country in Africa, Europe, and Asia, but it was done, and the disease Rinderpest no longer exists. There are the world agreements that have been reached in recent decades. The disease smallpox, what used to be the worst killer of human history, no longer exists because the world, the WHO, the UN got together on an effort to eliminate smallpox. And boy, was that difficult, because the last cases of smallpox were in remote places. The very last cases were in Somalia, and it's hard to imagine a country where it's more difficult to undertake public health programs than Somalia. But it worked, and the world eliminated smallpox. Other things that the world has succeeded in doing in the last few decades include the Montreal Protocol to get chlorofluorocarbons, the refrigerant gases, out of the atmosphere when it was discovered that they were destroying the ozone layer. To get it out of the atmosphere, you had to get every country to agree to get out the chlorofluorocarbons. There was a lot of screaming, but the result was the Montreal Protocol. There's the Marpol Agreement about oil tankers spilling oil on the high seas. The Marpol Agreement applies to oil tankers from every country. And again, that was hard to negotiate, but the result is that oil tankers on the high seas are now double-hulled, and oil spills on the high seas are much, much rarer nowadays. There was the Law of the Sea Convention to delineate economic zones in shallow water on the continental shelves. Countries with a seacoast, they have overlapping economic zones, overlapping zones of shallow water with fisheries and navigation and so on. And every country on the seacoast has economic zones overlapping or potentially overlapping with some other countries. So again, it was really difficult to get those negotiations, but the result of the negotiations is that the economic zones in shallow water are now delineated for the whole world. Every country managed to agree to it. And more recently, there's the establishment of the Seabed Authority to regulate mining of mineral nodules on the ocean floor. Turns out that on the ocean floor there are mineral nodules of pure minerals. It's a much, while there are problems of course, it's a much cleaner way to extract minerals, to pick up these pure nodules from the ocean floor than to mine them on land where there are all the tailings and messes and the dirt that results. It took decades to reach an agreement because landlocked countries that don't have a seacoast did not want the minerals on the seafloor to be mined by countries that do have a seacoast, which would get all the money and the landlocked countries would get no money. But as a result of lengthy negotiations, the Seabed Authority reached agreement on mining minerals from the seabed floor so that even landlocked countries like Bolivia and Laos get something like 15% of the royalties, and every country in the world has signed off on the Seabed Authority for making it now feasible to extract minerals from the seafloor. These are examples of really difficult problems. Yes, climate change and nuclear agreement and sustainable resource management and inequality, those are difficult problems, but they're not more difficult than the eradication of smallpox or the delineation of coastal zones. That gives me cause for optimism. The world really does have a track record of solving the most difficult problems, and because we did solve those most difficult problems, there's at least reasonable grounds for hope that we will solve the other difficult problems that face the world today. Nevertheless, clearly, it's a matter of touch and go because the world does have major problems. What's the chances that humanity is going to get out of this all okay? The metaphor that I use for this, the way I think of it, is that the world is now engaged in a horse race between two horses, a metaphorical horse race. One of the horses is the horse of destruction. All of the problems, nuclear, climate change, the horse of destruction. And the other horse in the race is the horse of hope. The horse of hope, the resolution of these world problems, the increasing realization of people that climate change is due to humans, the increasing involvement of big international businesses in protecting the environment, not just doing bad things. In a normal horse race, the two horses get out of the starting gate and they run at constant speed until the end of the race. This is not a normal horse race where the two horses run at constant speed. This is an exponentially accelerating horse race in which the horse of destruction is going faster and faster. World population is increasing, technology is increasing, the problems are getting more and more serious. But also the horse of hope is going exponentially faster and faster. More and more people are realizing that climate change is real and is caused by us, and more people are dealing with recognizing problems of inequality and resource use around the world. How is it all going to end up? Well, we don't know. All I can say is that it will be settled within the next 30 years, and I say the next 30 years because at the rate at which we are non-sustainably mining essential resources, we can carry on the way we are going now, only for about another 30 years before we run out of essential resources like topsoil and water and so on, and it will be too late. So those of you, because I'm 81 now, I'm not going to see the outcome 30 years from now, but there are lots of you here who are young enough who will see the outcome 30 years from now. People often ask me, Jared, are you an optimist or a pessimist? And my answer is I'm a cautious optimist. What that means is that I rate the chances at least 51% that we will have a happy landing, and no more than 49% that we will have an unhappy landing. But in reality, whether we have a happy landing or an unhappy landing depends upon our choices. It depends upon whether you vote and how you vote and whether people around the world vote, because the problems that the world faces, all problems that we humans are causing. The problem that we face is not the problem of an asteroid hurtling towards us and there's nothing we can do about it. All our problems, climate change, nuclear proliferation, unsustainable resource use, etc., they're all problems caused by us humans, and because we're causing them, we can also choose to stop causing them. I hope that we will choose to stop causing them. And of course, part of my motivation for writing this book was the hope that we could learn from history. There are lots of countries that have faced national crises, and in recent times there have been regional crises. There are some things that make it likely that a country will get through a crisis, and there are some things that make it unlikely that a country will get through a crisis. My hope is that we can learn from history. We don't have to repeat the errors of history. We don't have to repeat the mistakes that have been tried and they didn't work. There really are generalizations, and if we choose to learn from history, then perhaps we will have a happy ending. That's a cheerful note on which we can now turn over to questions. I should say for the questions, I would especially favor questions from young people, high school students, college students, people recently out of college, because you are the ones who are going to be most affected by the consequences. And then also, realistically, I'd somewhat favor questions from women over men, because the reality is that men tend to be more pushy. And so let's have questions, favoring questions from young people and from women, but also men have a right to raise questions.
If you'll just raise your hand if you have a question. Okay, I'm coming up over here. I'm finding the women and young people. Okay, you? Yeah.
Thank you so much for doing all this research and comparison. It's terrifying. But I'm thinking as you're talking, the people who need to hear this are probably not in this room and probably aren't going to read your book. Are there any plans to make like a cartoon or an animated video out of it?
Yeah. That's a good question. It's a good practical question, and it's something with which I was, of course, concerned in writing the book. What good does it do to write a book that just reinforces the views of those who already share my views? A book, to be effective, has to appeal to the whole political spectrum in the United States, for example. And when you read the book, you will see in the prologue the word Trump, President Trump, appears only once in the book. There's a sentence in the prologue where I say the word Trump will not appear henceforth in the book, for a couple of reasons. One, because the problems of the United States preceded the current presidency, and they will still be here after the current presidency. Secondly, because things are changing so rapidly in the United States that anything I had written about President Trump in August 2017 would have gone out of date a week later. But the remaining thing is that I want the book to be read by people all across the spectrum, not just by those who already share my views. So my hope is that it will be read across the spectrum. I can only say that of my previous books, I was delighted one day to get a phone call from the Chief of Staff of Governor Jeb Bush, then Governor Jeb Bush of Florida. The Chief of Staff said that in Florida, a big problem for Florida was the issue of Haitians and Dominicans in Florida, major problem with which Governor Jeb Bush was concerned. I had a chapter in my book, Collapse, on that issue. And so the Chief of Staff said that he was going to place my book on the desk of Governor Jeb Bush, and he was going to come back at 1 p.m. this afternoon to see whether Bush had read the book. I don't know whether Bush did read the book, but you can bet that the Chief of Staff would not have called me if my book had been a diatribe against his party.
Hi, thank you for coming tonight. You've given us a lot to think about. I have a neurocognitive disability, so I had to write this down, so please bear with me. Otherwise, I'm going to screw it up. So First Nations, Aboriginal, and Indigenous nations have had massive traumas inflicted upon them. Most of these nations are still not acknowledged by other nations, so there can be no compromises or allies. As a result, the peoples of these nations have experienced dire consequences related to multiple intergenerational traumas. You mentioned that Australia no longer has a White Australia policy, and that the University of Queensland campus where your son attended was very diverse. I used to live blocks from a UQ campus in Brisbane. Where was I? UQ's website says that currently there are 25 staff members, which make up 0.42% of their entire staff, are Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander, and only 0.57% of the students are currently Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander. But Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people make up 3% of Australia's current population. So similarly to Native American and First Nation populations of North America, Indigenous Australians face significantly higher rates of mental health crises, poverty, addiction, chronic health conditions, lower life expectancies, alcoholism, et cetera. I could go on. So where do resiliency and finding allies fit in here?
Everything that you say is true. There are big problems in the United States about the unjust, as putting it mildly, unjust treatment of Native Americans and African Americans and various immigrant groups going back centuries in the United States, but in Australia as well, while Australia since 1964 has backed away from its White Australia policy. As you've seen, Aborigines are still economically disadvantaged, and substantially they are legally and educationally disadvantaged in Australia. Australia, yes, isn't it wonderful that Australia is now admitting so many Asian immigrants, but what about its homegrown problems of its treatment of the Aborigines? Yeah, these are major problems. What can I say about them? Be grateful that my book discusses only the problems that it does discuss and doesn't discuss other major problems, because my book is 499 pages long. And there's a lot to be said about the problems of discrimination within the US and within Australia. And there's a lot to be said about the role of women in the United States. When I graduated college in 1958, it was when I taught my first class at UCLA Medical School in 1966. My first class had 62 students, of which 58 were white men and 2 were Asian women. So women are also the victim of have been the victims of maltreatment in the United States. It has gotten less bad over the last 60 years, but it's a problem that's still with us. So I agree with you.
I work in international humanitarian assistance, most recently on the complex emergencies in Iraq and Yemen. So I very often see the firsthand effects of a country going through a crisis, an upheaval. And I'm wondering if your research indicates any practical ways forward for countries who are in the middle of an upheaval to work themselves out of it.
Practical ways for a country that's in the middle of the upheaval to work their ways out of it. I've not been to Iraq and Afghanistan, so I cannot personally suggest what could get those countries out of their present problems, which seem to me overwhelming. I can only say that the countries where I have been, the ways to get out of a crisis are the ones that I've discussed. But you'll undoubtedly come back and say, well, that's all very well, but if you're in a dictatorship, and a really nasty dictatorship, what can you do to get your way out of the situation? There, again, in our personal lives, you know that there are people who face soluble problems, and there are people who face overwhelming problems, and it's difficult to be optimistic and cheerful about people who face overwhelming problems. It's difficult for me to be optimistic and cheerful about some countries in the world where the problems are just so overwhelming. I can't speak offhand about Iraq and Afghanistan, but I would say that it appears to me that Iraq and Afghanistan face problems that are harder to solve than those faced by Finland, Chile, Japan, Indonesia, Australia, and Germany. Perhaps we're ready for a man to ask a question.
Well, I already promised this woman.
Hi, I'm a history teacher here in Virginia, and so when I've presented and used Guns, Germs, and Steel before, I love how my students critique your research. And so looking at this and anticipating things, you profile 6 different upheavals. And you had said you'd lived in 5 of those countries, which would give you experience. How would you respond to the criticism, because you're saying you draw comparisons from those, that maybe there are other ones that maybe could have been discussed and maybe you would draw different conclusions had you looked at other examples?
You're absolutely right. And so I discussed 6 countries and how would I respond to the criticism that if you looked at the other 210 countries of the world, you might come to different conclusions. That's absolutely true. And it's a limitation that I discuss in the preface and in the epilogue of my book. I had the choice of selecting countries somewhat at random around the world to provide a fair slice of the world's countries. I don't have any African country. I wanted to have a chapter on South Africa, which I visited all, but I just don't understand South Africa well enough. So it is true that my sample is a small sample and it's a biased sample. The reason I chose that sample is that those are the countries that I know the best. And I thought it would be better for me to discuss countries that I know the best, even though they're a biased sample, and leave it to others who know better other countries to see whether my conclusions apply to other countries. So you're right, and we will see.
Hi. So at the end, you mentioned the 4 problems that you see as the biggest problems that are facing the country, or facing the world, rather. And you mentioned that humanity has overcome a number of problems. Specifically, you used smallpox as an example, the law of the sea as another example, and you interestingly listed climate change as the second in order of magnitude, which I found kind of confounding. But I digress. The 4 problems that you mentioned, of one, smallpox had a universal appeal. Nobody wants to die of smallpox. There's not really any smallpox lobby. There's not any interest in protecting and or continuing the perpetuation of smallpox. Law of the sea has been an utter failure in the South China Sea and is likely to be one of the focal points of a military conflict within the next 10 years as a naval arms race continues to grow in that area. And then the 4 problems that you did mention, all 4 of those problems have enormously powerful interests that are vested in not overcoming them. So while, yes, we've had some great successes as humanity in addressing common problems that threaten us all, in general, those problems have been problems that truly threatened all of us. And I feel that the 4 problems that you've described as the major problems that are facing us don't really affect all of us, and the people that they don't affect are generally the ones that have the most power to change or not change them.
I take that to be a comment rather than a question. No, that's okay because it's a good comment. Your comment is in effect that the examples of success for the world that I pointed out, you suggest they were easier to achieve than will be success at solving the 4 problems of nuclear proliferation, climate change, et cetera. And you may well be right about that, but we have no choice about it. Those are the problems that we face now. Am I going to roll over and be pessimistic because the problems that we've solved, that the world has solved, are less difficult problems than the problems that we now face? All I can say is that the problems we face are the ones that we're stuck with, and we have to make our best efforts, and I hope that we'll succeed, even if you are correct that they are more difficult problems, and you may be correct about that.
Of the problems that you mentioned of our crisis, I was a little bit surprised that you didn't mention our debt. You know, we're borrowing at record levels, and at what point can we sustain that?
Problem of national debt. Yes, the United States, the US borrows and it has a large national debt. There are countries with worse national debts. And in fact, you'll see that my book has 2 chapters on Japan. One is on Japan in the Meiji era, the 1800s. The other chapter is on modern Japan, the Japan that I know through my Japanese relatives and students. If you ask Japanese people themselves, what do they see as the most serious problems facing Japan? Usually the first thing they'll say is what you say, the national debt facing Japan. Japan has relatively the highest national debt of any major first world economy. It's equal to something like 2.6 times the national output. Japan's national debt proportionally is greater than that of Italy and Spain. Japanese will say in defense that the Japanese national debt is held overwhelmingly by Japanese people themselves rather than overseas. So perhaps it's less worrisome than the national debt of Italy, but nevertheless, Japanese people will bring it up right away as a major problem facing Japan. And there are lots of Americans who are also concerned about national debt for the United States. From what I hear from economists, I personally am more worried about the breakdown of political compromise and inequality within the United States than I am about the U.S. national debt, but I may be wrong about that. And I acknowledge that be grateful that my chapter on the United States chapters discussed only what I saw as the 4 major problems without discussing other major problems such as national debt, because the result is that my book is 499 pages, and when you lie back in bed at night, you can hold it over your head and read it instead of it being too heavy to read, which it would have been if I had discussed national debt. Maybe that is a good question on which to end things. We clearly have not exhausted your opinions, and we clearly have not exhausted the points you've raised, and there's much else to discuss. But what I would say in conclusion is, as a starting point, go out there and vote, and in the next election, and when you're getting ready to vote, convince 10 of your friends to vote, and tell them to convince 10 of their own friends to vote. That's already 100 votes. But remember that the 2000 presidential election was in effect decided by 700 voters in the state of Florida. So if 350 people had voted the other way, there would have been a different president. And remember also that a recent gubernatorial election for the state of Washington was decided by 300 votes. And so if 15 18-year-olds in the state of Washington who didn't vote had voted and had convinced 10 of their friends to vote, Washington might have had a different governor. So whatever you do, go out and vote, but also read my book. Thank you.